So we're joined today by Richard Digby Smith. And Richard, again, thanks very much for joining us. It's really, really nice of you to join us. I'm just trying to show this book on the screen here. And so that's the book I'm currently reading, which is, of course, your book, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, The Life and Times of a Recording Studio Engineer. I'm already enjoying it, you know, a lot. I'm up to chapter 6. So my questions might home in on a lot of stuff from chapter 6, but there's already loads of great stuff. But just to kick it off, I mean, obviously, like any book, it's an autobiography. So it starts off with your early days and kind of leads through. And maybe a good lead-in point would be if we talk maybe about the violin, which is up on the shelf behind your shoulder, and how that sort of played a role in your love of music and getting into doing stuff.
It's my father's violin, which he had given to him when he was about 13, and that was the first instrument he learned to play. That's what attracted my father, I think, to music. Of course, you're talking about the mid-1930s when my father was a teenager. In fact, he often used to say, when I would ask of him, what were your teenage years like at that time, he would just look at me and say, well, he left school on the Friday in short trousers, started work on the Monday with long trousers. So he went from a boy to a man. So his teenage years were essentially a Saturday and a Sunday. Yeah. And it was from my father's love of music. He was a semi-professional musician on Birmingham dance band scene, and it was contagious, and I picked it up from him.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about, one of the things you talked about, I think, was you said about Glenn Miller, and your dad had a love of Glenn Miller, and so did mine.
So my father did as well.
There you go. Yeah. So I still remember my dad bought my sister for a birthday present a vinyl record turntable, not a very expensive one. And then I think it must have been the next weekend he went down to the local secondhand store and came back with some records. They were like jazz, and it was all his music, you know. It was nothing for my sister at all. But I got an attraction for Glenn Miller. Do you sort of appreciate Glenn Miller and what he did, and what he does? You know, what was about? You know,
the first record when we first bought a record player in our house which would have been in the late 50s, early 60s. The very first record we bought was the Golden Guinea Age of Dance Bands. These were records that were a guinea, which there may be some of your listeners and viewers who would appreciate £1, 1 shilling, 21 shillings. And it was the Golden Age of Dance Bands, and it featured Glenn Miller and Artie Shaw, all the big bands of that period, and I got a taste for it then. I wish my father, as many of us do who have become orphans, I wish my father was still around, because I enjoy that sort of music even more today than I did when he was around. I feel musically we would have much more to share today.
Yeah. That's nice. I think Joe Loss was another one my dad used to play quite a lot. I'm sure you came across Joe Loss. But so I guess you were a wannabe musician and wanting to get into music yourself, I think, to begin with, yeah?
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about that.
14 years of age, standing outside my sister's bedroom door. She was 4 years older than me. She still is 4 years older. And my sister Pat, she had brought home the first Beatles album, Please Please Me. And it was blasting away from this tiny record player with a speaker in the lid. Very tinny, very trebly, but you could hear the music. And I'm standing outside the bedroom door with my sister blasting out the first track on the first side of the first Beatle album, and it starts off with Paul McCartney going 1, 2, 3, 4, and
of course, yeah.
Into I Saw Her Standing There, and it was at that particular moment.
Just a little visual clue there.
1, 2, 3, 4. When I heard Paul McCartney canteen that I saw her standing there, it sent a shiver down my spine, and I knew then where my life's journey was heading, and it was I wanted to be part of that excitement. And
what was your main instrument? Was it guitar?
I picked up my first instrument was a tennis racket.
Well done.
I stood in front of the wardrobe mirror with the easy to learn the chords, and you just
always look good.
And then saved up a few weeks of paper round money and pocket money, and bought an acoustic guitar. Bought a book by an English guitar legend, Burt Weedon.
I have the same book.
Playing a day.
Eric Clapton, Jimi Hendrix, Pete Townsend, Jeff
everyone.
Beck, George. We all started with Burt Weedon's Playing a Day, and so I figured out all the chords and started jamming along to the Beatle records, and was convinced it was only a matter of time before I would be discovered as the next Paul McCartney. It hasn't happened yet, but you live in hope.
So you just sort of move, because I've read some of this stuff in the book, and I kind of it's a really great story, by the way, and I'm so envious actually of the way it's worked out for you. You've had an amazing career, and as you acknowledge yourself in the book, you've quite a lot of luck to some extent to it. But so, I mean, can I just say about going back to your dad again, because when you sort of moved towards actually step back. I was going to talk about the Bakelite phone, but before we get to the Bakelite phone, let's talk about knocking on the doors. And I think it was number 39. I think it was, if I'm right, it was the lucky door.
It was the lucky door. 38 was the lucky door.
Yes, that's right.
Introduced me to number 39. I was engaged as a training manager at a supermarket in the local area, and I stumbled across a magazine article that talked about, it was by Eddie Offord, no less, and he worked at Advision Studios in London. And I scanned through the pages of this article by Eddie Offord, and it described a typical day in a recording studio with everybody from the T-boy to the assistant engineer, the engineers, the studio managers, the musicians, and it just screamed off the page at me as to this is where I got to go. So in my lunch break, we're going back now to 1969. So it was pre-mobile phone, pre-internet. I went to the local library in Erdington in Birmingham, got a London telephone directory and looked up recording studios. It was like a London Yellow Pages kind of thing. And there were 38 of them. And I wrote down the name and address and phone number of all 38 by hand on a couple of sheets of paper. And then when I got home, over the course of the next couple of days, I wrote to each and every one of them, inquiring as to any vacancies in the studio. I'd be prepared to make tea, wash cars, polish shoes, anything just to get my foot in the door. And I sent off 38 letters and awaited 38 replies. I got 3 replies, and they all said no. Sorry, good luck. Undeterred, Stephen, as you'll know from reading the book, I planned my revenge, and I checked into the YMCA in London. I got the train down from Birmingham, checked into the YMCA for 3 nights. So over those 4 days and 3 nights, I walked the streets of London, and I went physically to all of the studios on my list. Absolutely all of them. I say all of them. By the Thursday evening, it's October 1969. It's winter. It's cold. It's wet. I'm cold. I'm wet. I've had 37 rejections. The back of my knuckles from banging on the door was red raw, pressing bells. Undeterred, wasn't going to go to the last one on the list, number 38, but that little voice inside your head that I think we all recognise that. The little voice inside my head said that there are 38 studios on this list. You've only been to 37 of them. What's wrong with with number 38? And I argued with myself. I said, well, there's nothing wrong with number 38. I just want to go home. I've had enough. I'll give it up. But no, number 38. And that was Maximum Sound Studios on the Old Kent Road. And by now it was about 5 o'clock in the evening. And I got the tube. I marched down the Old Kent Road. I found Maximum Sound Studios, which was probably no bigger than the room you're in at the moment, Steve. It was a one-man, tiny little 8-track studio. And the old guy who worked, well, he seemed like an old guy to me. He was probably only in his late 20s, but to me, he seemed like an old guy because I was only 19. And I got the same response from him that I'd had from the previous 37. And as I say in the book, when he said, there isn't any work here for you, young man, I wish you luck. And as I turned to leave his studio and I put my hand on the door to walk out onto the streets of London, I imagined that I was actually, as to all intents and purposes, was opening the door and stepping back onto the streets of Birmingham and back to the supermarket. And as I went to leave, he said to me, hold on a second, he said, Island Records are building a studio over by Portobello Road. They might want somebody. And he grabbed a most beautiful scrap of paper and wrote down the name Frank Owen and 229-1229, the phone number. And the rest, I explore in the book how that led me to career in the music business, thanks to that elderly chap on the Old Kent Road.
Yeah, so suffice to say, you took him up on his advice and you went to try Ireland. And as I remember, they were in the midst of getting a studio together at that time. They were just starting one off, and then a short while later, maybe in the next week, I don't know, your dad answered the phone. You described this Bakelite phone.
Yes.
And you had that call you've been waiting for, and your dad was delighted for you, as far as I can understand.
He was indeed. We were posh on our end of the council estate. We were the first people, in fact, the only people in our immediate vicinity who had a telephone. And the reason we had a telephone installed was so that my father could take bookings for the bands that he was playing with. So the Bakelite phone was a central feature of our life growing up. And I'd had an interview at the Island Basing Street studios as a result of that chap giving me the phone number. And I awaited a call from Island as to whether I had a job. And the phone rang. It was Penny Hanson, who was the general manager at Island at the time, in late 1969. My dad answered the phone, and he just beamed, and he handed the phone over to me. He said, "It's Penny Hanson from Island Records," and
wow.
he knew I'd got the job.
Yeah, and just to say about your dad, the other thing which there's so many things which resonate with me from your book, but I can't go on about them all. But I'm only on chapter 5. But what I loved about your dad, you said about the idea of bookings. Now Tony has a part in an agency, booking bands and all kinds of stuff. So he gets all of that. So he's kind of the other side as well as being a musician. But your dad would jump on a bus with his instruments and go off and do the gig, wouldn't he?
Yes, he would. He'd come home from work, change out of his work clothes, put on his bow tie and dinner jacket and polished black patent leather shoes, and pop his sacks in the case, check that he got enough reeds in the case for the night's work ahead of him, and then jump on a bus and go all the other side of town.
Wow. It's just I mean, you've talked that story now. At the time, I suppose it was almost kind of normal. People were doing that, but it just seems like a different world, doesn't it?
It does. On the downside of it, Steve, was that we didn't actually see too much of Dad because
No,
he
no.
worked from 6:30 in the morning, and then as soon as he came home, he'd be out gigging most nights.
Did you get to see any of his gigs?
I did, just 2 or 3. Usually around Christmas time when he had a local works do in a band. I've got some photographs of him.
Oh, nice.
Recently, picture of him playing alongside a chap called Larry Winwood. They're in the same band, and they've got the music stand in front of them with the name of the band leader. I think it's an M, so I don't know who he was. And there's Larry Winwood, who I later find out is Steve and Muff Winwood's father. I'm showing that picture to Muff.
Wow, how coincidental is that?
Pardon?
How coincidental is that?
Wasn't that? It wasn't.
Yeah,
absolutely. My father played with Mr. Winwood Senior.
Wow. And the first person you saw when you went to Ireland, if I remember, you got there just before they closed, was Muff Winwood coming down the stairs.
Winwood, and I recognise it because I was a massive, big Spencer Davis fan.
Yeah.
At that time in my life, and I'd seen them live on a couple of occasions, so I knew what they looked like. And as I'm sat in reception waiting to speak to somebody about this career opportunity, it was Muff Winwood who came running down the spiral staircase.
On his way to leave, I guess.
On his way to leave, and he pointed to me. He went, "Oh, good to see you," and he shouted back upstairs to the office, "The minicab's here." So I've impersonated my first impression.
That's right. Yeah.
Was that I was a minicab driver impersonator. I reminded Muff of that on several occasions.
Yeah, because obviously, I mean, you got to know Muff and Stevie. I mean, you got to know the Winwoods very well, didn't you? And work with them quite closely.
Absolutely. Began to assist. Became assistant engineer on some of the traffic stuff. With the senior engineer was a chap called Brian Humphreys, who was like myself, a fellow Brummie, and Brian was a top-rated engineer who Chris Blackwell had poached from Pi Studios in Marble Arch. So I got to meet Steve on all those. It would be on the tail end of John Barleycorn Must Die, Shootout at the Factory, at the Fantasy Factory. So I was assistant engineer on those sessions, but later on did actually work with Steve as the main engineer.
So we'll come back to Brian in a bit, because I believe his wife once did you a favour to do with getting you a recording session indirectly.
In a delightful, innocent way, yes.
I don't know. Should we talk about that now? Because as soon as I've mentioned it, it's quite a nice story too.
As an assistant engineer, I'm winding forward a bit because the first couple of months I was basically just cheap tea boy and running around in the mail room delivering all the posts to the different. Never turn down an opportunity to start your career in the mail room. It's a great place to start because what it does, it gets you to go and meet face to face all the executives and the secretaries and the heads of department at a company, because and if you smile and make yourself sort of noticeable, it can work wonders. But then it didn't take too long because they were recruiting for young engineers, and as an assistant engineer, you would be called upon to work considerably long hours, and a lot of the sessions you do typically at 10 a.m. till 5 p.m., 6 p.m. session, and then have a half-hour break, set up the studio for the evening session. And often the evening sessions were with the island artists of the day. One band in particular was Bronco, and Brian had engineered their previous record and was engineering their current album, and I was assisting for Brian. Brian was a happily married man, and but was never a big fan of working late. And invariably the phone would ring about 10:30, 11 o'clock, and it would be Brian's wife inquiring as to how late might you be, Brian? Dinner's in the oven, and it would be nice. So Brian invariably left the sessions at his wife's behest shortly before midnight, which always amazed the guys in the band, Bronco, on those particular sections with Jess Roden as the lead vocalist. The band were a little dismayed at that because they felt that their creativity levels were just in the ascendancy at about that time of night.
Yeah.
And were keen to carry on. Yes.
Yeah.
So I used to say goodbye to Brian, and he'd leave me with the desk all set up to finish whatever overdub we were doing. And I was instructed at that point to tear the desk down, switch everything off, send the band home. But being the incorrigible youth that I was at the time, I'd already figured out how to change tracks on the multi-track tape machine, how to adjust headphone levels. So by the time we came back in the next evening, Brian was always amazed that we'd done like 7 guitar overdubs, 3 lead vocals, and a couple of rough mixes. And I'd worked right through till sort of 6 in the morning. Sleep on the sofa in the control room, ready for a 9 o'clock start. So, but Brian was very generous and encouraged me immensely and showed me so many aspects of recording, not just recording technology, important though that is. Brian taught me a lot about studio etiquette and how to conduct yourself in the studio. So I'm eternally grateful to Brian, and I still keep in touch with him today on Facebook.
So in effect, that kind of led you to the next level, didn't it? To get to the next level, really. You
because when the band, and it was quite a sort of production line of albums working for the Island record label. As I mentioned in the book, all the, you can think of all the artists that were on Ireland at that time.
Amazing label.
Fairport Convention, Free, Traffic, Who, Paul, Toots and the Maytals, Jimmy Cliff. I mean, we had an amazing roster of artists. Yeah. As a young engineer, it was just such fertile ground to catch your teeth and develop your craft. So when Bronco booked in, within only a few months later, they were back in doing yet another album, and they requested me to be the engineer.
So that was getting your name in lights, I suppose, was it?
With my first album that I engineered in time.
Yeah. You mentioned a couple of people there, which I can't ignore those references. First of all, Toots.
Yes, sad, recent.
Yeah. What's your memories of Toots?
A gentleman, a consummate professional, a happy man. Typically, around about that time when Toots would have been recording for Ireland, you would be one of a number of engineers that it would be like a roster, and you look on the bookings board in the morning, and you'd see that you were booked in such and such a band that day, and then another band the next day, or another session in the evenings. So I didn't spend an awful lot of time in the studio with Toots, but would see him around, and like so many people of that era, a consummate professional, a true gentleman, and so it's the absence of ego. On reflection, when I look back at some of the great musicians that I've had the pleasure to work with, it's people say, "Oh, he must have been difficult to work with. He was a bit of a, I would say, almost without exception, there's a demeanor that comes into force when you're in the studio with people. You're at your place of work, and it's work that presides over everything. There's very little room for ego, and Toots. One of the earliest Ireland reggae successes, I think it was Toots who even coined the term.
Yeah, on the song which refers to reggae. Yeah, the reggae song, so called.
So we had Toots and Jimmy Cliff
Hmm.
in the studio working with those guys quite a few years before Bob Marley and these guys turned up.
Yeah, I was just reading about Bob Marley in your book last night, by the way.
Okay. So you've done the drug bust.
Yes, yeah. We'll come on to that. That's a great story. You mentioned Fairport Convention. I don't. Of course, Richard and Linda Thompson have just put out I think it's a triple gatefold sleeve pack of all that stuff. So you must have worked with Richard Thompson quite a bit. Did you ever work with Linda?
The time I worked with Richard and with Linda, I never kept a diary, as I mentioned in the book. So a lot of it is really off the top of my head as I'm going along, thinking about it. I would have done some sessions with Richard if he would have appeared as a guest guitarist on some albums and some recordings. But I remember working for a significant amount of time, for a couple of weeks, out at the Manor in Oxfordshire.
Oh yeah, beautiful place.
Yeah, with Richard and Linda Thompson, along with all the other Fairport group, a whole bunch of people. Sandy Denny,
Dave Pegg, Danny Thompson, all that gang.
Danny Thompson, Pat Donaldson, just the whole Fairport bunch. And we did an album of rock and roll cover tunes, and that featured Richard.
Oh, did you reproduce that?
And that was called The Bunch.
Wow!
Trevor Lucas produced it.
Okay.
You'll come to a story about it.
Okay, all right, yeah.
Later in the normally when you get given a copy of a record you've worked on, selfishly, the first thing you do is turn it over to make sure they spelt your name correctly on the credits.
Yes.
So Trevor Lucas proudly handed me a copy of the Bunch album that we had at the Manor. And I looked at the cover and it was fabulous, and I turned it over and I'm reading through the credits and my name was omitted. And I pointed this out to Trevor and he just turned an embarrassing shade of red. Just one of those unfortunate omissions. Too late then. Yeah. But it was a great record to work on, and that was the main thing.
The reason that I mentioned Linda Thompson is that I recently interviewed Linda for the site. She was in California with her husband, who's a guy called Steve Kennis, a kind of Hollywood director guy, I think.
Okay, yes, her name.
But a fantastic interview, and it wouldn't surprise you probably to if I told you that so far it's the most popular interview that we've done.
Excellent.
It's huge, because again, Linda's got some fantastic stories, hasn't she?
She's one of these, not undiscovered by any means, but one of those artists, as indeed is Richard Thompson, that just lie there, just under the horizon, and
I guess
part of the British music scene for so long. They're absolutely fundamental artists.
Yeah, folk is, you kind of see it as kind of a specific genre, but it's much bigger, I think, than people imagine. But you were talking just now about, and I'm not gonna ask you to name any names. I don't take this too directly now. But you said about most people you work with, almost to a person, have been great. But obviously there have been a couple of instances along the way. So I just want to say two words to you: Stephen Stills. And tape editing.
I was assistant engineer on Stephen Stills 2, the imaginatively titled second solo album that he did. I must have stayed up all night coming up with that title. But I wouldn't have had too much. As assistant engineer, you're busy. You're doing a lot of running around, picking up broken headphones, making sure there's again, we're going back, Steve and Tony, you'll appreciate this, back to the days of analog tape.
Yes.
So you were constantly making sure there would be enough tape for the next take, make sure you were on the right take of the right tune to be overdubbing on. So as opposed to when you become a full first engineer, then you have a lot more direct contact with the artist than you would do as an assistant. But so you're kind of like you pass in the night in dark control rooms with all these artists that are mingling around the smoke-filled control room and stuff. But he was a very excitable young man, Stephen, and there was no shortage of indulgence. We'll leave it at that. But very productive, very talented, great Hammond organ player, loved beautiful guitar sounds. I say in the book a wonderful story about working with Bill Halverson.
Yes, because Bill Halverson, if I'm right, maybe I misinterpreted it, but I think there was a problem with an edit perceived by Stephen Stills, and as you said, for those people you said earlier about a guinea, people don't even remember what are you talking about, tape, what's that, you know?
Yes,
but you know, when I worked in radio for years.
There was the fragility of tape.
Totally.
I'm so relaxed and pleased to be working in a
digital environment. Yeah.
Environment. I make multiple copies. Whenever I change anything, I save it and then I save it on another drive. So I've got copies. I've got copies down here in the dining room. I've got copies upstairs in my studio of everything. Not the case back in 1971.
No.
2-inch tape. When you attach the leader tape in between takes to assemble what would be referred to as a master reel, which would have all the main takes that you would be overdubbing on. I always thought that was a bit precarious, potential for great damage, having all your master takes on one reel, but that was the practice. And one evening, a tape was rewinding through the head guides and the pinch wheels, and the assistant engineer who'd worked on that particular stage of the recordings. This was on Stephen's first album. I wasn't assistant on that. I was chief T-boy at that time. I was hanging around the control room, so I saw this happen. And as the tape machine was in rewind, and it rewinds at incredibly fast speed. It's you get hands off, otherwise it'll take your fingers off. And the machine was in rewind, and the leader tape just caught on one of the tape guides and proceeded to tear all the way down the tape. Started off at about a millimeter tear at the top, and by the time Bill Halverson had I hit the stop button, Bill Halverson put his hands on the spools to slow them down even quicker, which took most of the flesh off both of his hands.
God.
And the tape finally ground to a halt with by now the tear had gone about halfway down the tape. And Stephen wasn't very happy. And the assistant engineer who shall remain
nameless, yes,
to protect his future career and relationships.
Not really his fault, really, I suppose. It's
it wasn't entirely his fault. It could have happened to any of us, and but it just shows you how attentive and how concentrated you have to be when you're splicing tape together. Anyway, suffice to say, Bill, who was a genius of a giant of a man, stuck the tape back together. How he took him several hours with tiny 1-inch pieces of splicing, 1/4-inch splicing tape on the back, on the reverse side of the tape, and just went along and literally taped the tape back together and saved the day.
And it sounded okay.
It did, and the very next thing he immediately did was have the tape taken over to, I don't know where it was, whether it was Abbey Road or somewhere where they could do tape duplication, and he had the 2-inch reel copied.
Okay.
So we had a first generation copy, but without any splicing tape on it.
Another thing, it's a great story, that, by the way. But another thing that you mentioned is Paul Rodgers, and I know you got a big affection for kind of that kind of classic rock, Free and Bad Company and that kind of stuff. And Paul Rodgers, I think he had a shouting moment with you to do with use of reverb.
Yes, it was. Now, just as a backstory, I would have spent up until reasonably recently working on some Free and some. I've recently, I say recently, 18 months ago or so, remixed some Bad Company stuff.
Oh yeah.
Listening to Paul's voice a lot,
Yeah.
and but with working with Free in several different formats of the band, I got to know Paul very well, Paul Rodgers, and we must have spent 1,000 hours in the studio together.
Whoa.
And so there was only one fractious moment, so it's not too bad.
That's why you remember it.
That's why we remember it. Good
Yeah.
point, Steve. Good point, well presented. Yeah, it was the wee hours of the morning. Everybody's tired. Paul's suddenly inspired. He wants to go do a vocal on a track we've been working on. Invariably, we work on the same tune. You get a backing track recorded early evening. Band will line out the arrangement and the basic parts, and then you do 2 or 3 takes till you nail it, and then you great take. That's the one you start overdubbing and adding extra guitars, percussion, possibly redoing the bass or whatever. Paul would have put a guide vocal on now. It's 4 o'clock in the morning. All the overdubs are finished. Paul wants to put the definitive lead vocal. He's feeling inspired. Everybody else just wants to go home. Paul wants to do the vocal. So it's your gig. That's what you do. So you make sure the mic's all set up. Paul always favoured an SM57, just for those who are interested in the technical side of stuff. No fancy condenser mics for Paul. He liked less a 57, which sometimes he would even grab the mic stand when he'd be doing a vocal tape, as if he was in a live scenario. You know, that's all added to the feel. You'd see him in the studio with his great mic technique. So he's all ready to do a vocal. We do a quick run through the first verse just to check for levels, and I made the mistake of sending the reverb that we were monitoring in the control room. I inadvertently sent the reverb to Paul's headphones, and he never liked reverb in it. He always preferred it dry, and he snapped, and I cracked, and Paul flung the headphones on the floor. March stormed into the control room, and there was a lot of foul language and pointing of fingers, and don't ever, and I mean ever, put reverb on my, and it was, you know, it was a real veins in the head moment. And Paul Kossoff, the wonderful Paul Kossoff, bless him, stepped into my defense and literally stood between me and Paul. I mean, it wasn't going to come to fisticuffs. I'm not a fighter. You know, I wouldn't.
Record producer.
Yes. I've never used these for that, so I wouldn't have. You know, Paul, on the other hand, Rodgers, I'm not so sure. Maybe he might have wanted to elevate the confrontation a bit, but I just sort of apologised and backed off. And Paul Kossoff stood between me and Paul Rodgers, and Kossoff gave Paul Rodgers a bit of a grilling, and he said, "Don't ever speak to Digby like that. He's our engineer. He's the most important person in this room." This is Kossoff's word.
Yeah.
Probably I'm certainly more erudite about it in the book than I am telling you about it now.
Imagine.
It kind of makes it. I get emotional when I just think about it, you know. But Kossoff basically said to Rodgers, you know, let's back off. You know, let's not. Let's remember what it is Digby does, and we should be very respectful of him. At which point, it has to be said, Paul came over. Yeah. Big man hugs ensued. Yeah. And everything was fine. We were all tired. Yes. We were all emotionally engaged in the record. As you know yourself, guys, making a record, it's a roller coaster ride, you know.
Yeah.
It's just one of the bits at the bottom of the roller coaster.
Well, there's a lot to talk about in that, and I'll come back, because I know you quite a close relationship with Paul Kossoff, and I know that you and Paul Rogers were absolutely fine again afterwards. But Tony wanted to ask you a couple of things about kind of changes in technology really over the years, and because it's in the grand sense of things, it's we're talking 40, 50 years, in the length of the planet's not a long time. In the time of music production is quite a long time. So
yes.
Yeah, what I was interested in, obviously, Richard, is that, as you've already mentioned, starting off on tape and wind forward 50 odd years and it's digital. So what do you think has been the main changes in your career? I mean, obviously there's a lot of technology changes, but what would you say would be the main change that really changed the way that you were working? And is it a plus or a minus side to it?
Good question, Tony. I think it was President Roosevelt who said the fortunate thing about the future is that it only happens one day at a time. So I look back to those early days in the studio with tape. I'm often asked, how did I make not wishing to change your question, but I'll just approach it from a slightly different angle. How have you learnt to adapt from the relatively primitive state of analog recording to the current digital approach? It's happened gradually. It's happened over time. And I feel fortunate that the skills I learned from the old guys and learning how to work on tape for probably the first 20 years of my career has given me a lot of skills that I've managed to transfer into the digital environment. What I think guys and girls who have only come into the business with and since the advent of digital is that a lot of the things that make a piece of music sound great are not so crucial at the digital level, and they are areas of creativity that are no longer needed to be explored, such as real-time events, capturing the sound at source as opposed to being able to manipulate it later, being able to do multiple takes of, say, a lead vocal and then cut and paste it together at a later date. So there's an immediacy that I feel is lacking in some modern productions. It's a little linear, and it's a little, I liken it to paint by numbers. As long as you step back, it looks kind of okay. But when you look for the detail, you can see that all the 7s were blue, all the 11s are green, all the 13s are grey. Whereas an analog recording, I always liken it being more like paint and a palette and a canvas. And oftentimes a bit of blue gets mixed in with a bit of the yellow, which isn't supposed to be there. But you look at it and you go, you know what? I kind of like it. So I'm going to leave that smudgy bit. I'm going to leave that little streak in there. So I don't know if that answers your question, Dale.
Yeah.
I've meandered off into
I think it does, because I think that perhaps with the analog there had to be, because of the nature of it, there had to be more inventiveness, maybe, to get the sound that you want. And that's not really condoning, anything to do with digital, but I think sometimes people overdo the digital thing because they can. They've got everything at their fingertips, whereas perhaps with analog, you have to think around the problem, like you said about mending the tape. So you have to think around a problem, but that also created a creativity within that environment as well as the artist,
The other dramatic change, I would say, on reflection, from back in those days, if for want of a better term, and compared to today, I've worked with a lot of contemporary artists, especially down here in the southwest of England. Just finished an EP with Sarah Yo. She's a wonderful country singer, traditional singer-songwriter, plays wonderful guitar, beautiful voice, terrific lyrics. Just finished mixing an album with a Welsh band you guys might know, Puss Puss. I believe they're Cardiff-based. So there's plenty of good talent out there. Going back to comparing the quality of artists and musicianship today compared to back in the 70s and even the 80s, the simple fact of the matter was that you wouldn't even be allowed to set foot in a recording studio or a recording environment unless you could play your instrument.
No.
There were no amateurs in there. Everybody who stepped foot in the studio normally had a record deal, definitely would have had a band, and recording studios being as expensive, certainly then, to hire a recording studio. The only musicians you would work with in a recording studio would be top professional guys. And that's kind of changed today because with the democratization of music, which has a positive thing that it makes it available to men more. But on the downside, it's kind of it's lowered the common denominator somewhat.
Just a couple of other questions I wanted to ask you. I mean, you've worked with some fantastic artists. I mean, incredible, you know, over your career. Was there one particular artist or a group, or might have been more than one, where you just thought, wow, there is something really special going on here. This is something, you know, that perhaps I hadn't heard before, something that sort of triggered something with you?
Okay, time for a bit of name dropping then, I guess. Up there would have to be working with Led Zeppelin as assistant engineer to the late, great Andy Johns, who recorded most of Zep 3 and 4, and a lot of the overdubs and a lot of the mixing of those records was done at Basing Street Islands studios. And I had the pleasure of working on quite a number of those sessions. The most noteworthy being two that come to mind. One would be the recording of the backing track for Stairway to Heaven, which was done in Studio One at Basing Street. Andy Johns, the engineer. I was assistant engineer the night they cut that. That was a goosebumps down the back of the neck.
Yeah, should imagine.
Just hearing that in its rawness, and I tell a tale about that in the book.
Right.
I'll hold back on that. And another time with Zeppelin would have been the evening when Robert Plant performed and we recorded the vocal to "Since I've Been Loving You." That, again, whenever I hear that track, whenever I play it, and I do so at every opportunity, I listen to that, and I'm back there. I'm back in the control room in Studio One at Basing Street, looking down at Robert on the Neumann U87 microphone, delivering that vocal in one take from beginning to end, and being in a control room where everybody's just looking out the control room window. I don't know what the collective noun is for a group of dropped jaws. So those are two particularly spectacular moments that I remember. Many others.
Sure.
Prefab Sprout, one of the best albums I can remember ever recording on. One of the easiest, most free-flowing, enjoyable records was
fantastic album, Prefab Sprout. Yeah,
they were a great bunch of guys to work with. So many of the sessions with Free and Kossoff and Rabbit and they're all in the book, Tony.
Yeah, well, I'll be reading the book, that's for sure. It's just finally one thing I wanted to ask you, being a guitarist, and there's lots always talked about guitarists, you know, and what I'm always interested in really is not so much the technical ability of guitarists, but feel. And obviously, you know, I'm going to ask you about Paul Kossoff, who is one of my heroes as well. But do you think that he was probably one of the most naturally gifted guitarists that you worked with?
I think absolutely. You summed it up completely. I've always been disappointed over the years when you hear on radio shows where or in magazines where they vote the top 100 guitarists, and Kossi's rarely on there.
Yeah, I know.
And yet he should be in the top 5. I mean, he's up there. And I always liken it, Tony, to with vocalists. You've basically got the same set of tools. You've got the same sort of architecture.
Sure.
As anybody else. It's what you do with it.
Yeah.
All the great vocalists, whether it's Frank Sinatra, Nat King Cole, Robert Plant, Paul Rogers, Ella Fitzgerald, David Bowie, you know, you only have to hear 2 or 3 seconds of the voice and you know who it is. Rod Stewart's another one. You know, you just, they have a character, a style that is unique. And that's always for me, Tony, that is always the measure of quality. And with guitarists, I can tell, I don't need to look, I can tell if it's Jeff Beck, I pretty much can tell if it's Eric, I can certainly tell if it's Jimi Hendrix. And without a doubt, there is nobody that ever made a guitar sound like Paul Kossoff could.
Yeah, I would agree with you totally. And of course, you've got it firsthand having worked with him. But yeah,
well, I was a massive fan, Tony. I'm saying, book, you know, when I started off with my early days in Birmingham and going around all the little clubs and pubs in Birmingham and listening to all this music. But, you know, unbeknownst to me at the time, I was going to be part of that world. So I was a massive fan of Free before I set foot in the studio. And I used to have to constantly pinch myself to think, God, I'm actually working with these guys. And it was just a dream come true.
No, that's really a lovely story. But yeah, I think I agree with you. Kossoff, definitely one of the most underrated guitarists. And
his personality, his nature, he was a very gentle soul, a very unhurried, measured, and I have to say, the majority of the time, I spent quite a few years with Kossi in the studio over the years, a lot of time with him, right up until the end. And I mentioned in the book about the recording of the last album, the last record he worked on with Backstreet Crawler. And it's, how can I claim, it's not a claim to fame, but it's I never forget the fact that I was the engineer who recorded the last notes that Kossi never played in a studio, and that was on the Backstreet Crawler album when we were out in New York. And most of the time I spent with him, he wasn't a drug-crazed loser of a desperate, unhappy, vanishing soul. He was a lovely, lovely bloke and a great sense of humor. And for a large majority of the time, Tony, and to everybody who's listening, he was on the ball. You know, he just dabbled a bit too far. There were none of us were saints back in those days. You know, everybody had their own poison, whether it was too much booze or too much puff or whatever. Paul had a dispensation for particularly Mandrax, as I understand it, Downers. I never saw him indulge in anything heavier than that. I don't know, but a large proportion of the time I spent with Paul Kossoff was not with him in some drug-induced, wasted state. I'd just like to say that for the record. The majority of the time we spent together in the studio was great fun and very productive.
It's well said, because I think sometimes, you know, when people have tragic endings like he did,
yes,
they think that they were tragic people, you know, and I think what you just said is put the record straight there.
Thanks for the opportunity, Tony.
Yeah, that was a lovely exchange because you know, Tony, without embarrassing him, he's a pretty decent guitarist himself, and I know how much someone like Paul Kossoff, you know, his playing means to him. Talking about great guitarists, you said about people who aren't on the list of the top 100, and John Martin springs to mind as somebody you would have worked with quite a bit. What are your thoughts on working with John Martin?
Absolute barrel of laughs almost the whole time. Again, you know, you got to. I say this to all aspiring wannabes who might want to get into, particularly the creative arts. The number of times that I've heard rumours about people of how difficult they are to work with. Oh, you don't want to work with that band. Don't sign anything with that manager. Get your money up front. The guy's a crook. The guy's a villain. He's really difficult to work with. I don't know whether it's my just naive, blind ignorance, but I don't think I've ever come across anybody that I've found that difficult to work with. Well, I can think of one, but that was more recent. Here down in the southwest.
See, if this was ITV, you'd be say, go on, name him, but we're not going to do that to you.
I appreciate the fact that you don't. And
we'll let that one in our imagination.
I don't have a problem per se with courtrooms, but I prefer to be in them.
No, we won't go there.
And people often said about John Martin, oh, he drinks, it's like so hard to work with, he's so difficult, and you're going to, you know. I did 2 albums with John, Sunday's Child and Inside Out. And
lovely.
And I think what kept the whole ship afloat and kept it good-natured, which it was on both albums, was the presence of Danny Thompson.
Yes.
Because Danny was just so chilled and calm, and he was like the interpreter for John. He was the soundboard for John. He could bounce it all off Danny, and it would just wash over Danny. So, but I think put your head down, do a good job, be mindful of your artist's needs, understand that it's not a science, that somebody might want to, like we did one evening with John. It was 5 o'clock in the morning. We'd finished the session. We'd been working all night. It's 5 o'clock in the evening. We've ordered taxis to get us home. I think John and Danny possibly, I think, ordered an ambulance rather than a cab. But I was reasonably intact to take a cab home. But so I was sitting there waiting for the cabs to arrive. 5 o'clock in the morning. Sun's just coming up. John looks at me and says, is there any tape? Because we were back in the studio that same evening. So we just left the studio set as it was. So we just carry on a seamless join, probably 7 or 8 hours later. John said, is there any blank tape on the machine, on that reel? There you go, talking about tape. You know, is there any blank tape? Because I said, oh, there's got to be about 5 minutes worth of tape on the end of that reel. He said, I've just got this song I want to do. I've been dying to record this for ages. He said, while we wait, the cabs will, you know, they'll be a few minutes. Let's just go. So we went back into the control room. I hadn't switched the desk off or anything, so I just lifted the fade, switched up the acoustic guitar mic on and the vocal mic on. And John said, are you ready? And I went, yeah. So I said, but make it one take, because we've literally about 5 or 6 minutes worth of tape on the end of this reel. I pressed record, and John did a performance, a recording of my most favourite John Martin track of all time, which is Ellie Ree.
Okay.
And it appears on the digital CD reissue of Sunday's Child. There are a couple of versions of Ellie Ree. It's a song about slavery in the South. And John's tying this in with what you were saying, Steve and Tony, about guitar technique and not being on that list because they're not quite sort of public figures as such. John Martin, you listen to the guitar playing on Ellie Ree and consider that it's live with the vocal at the same time. There's a couple of little fret buzzes, which for me are the magical bits. They're the bits that make you, that draw you into it. rather than the perfection. But John's technique and style on acoustic guitar would certainly put him in my top 5.
For sure, he's right up there for me. What a great story, by the way. I'm glad I asked you about that.
Okay.
I love John Martin's stuff. I don't actually know that track. I'm gonna have to check it out.
Check it out. As I say, I've heard a couple of versions, and I've heard a couple of versions. I thought, no, that isn't the one we recorded.
And that's the one on the record. Yeah.
It's on. If you get the Sunday's, I believe, Sunday's Child CD. I believe it's on there with a couple of other additional tracks.
Brilliant.